All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our May 2022 StoryLab. I am Jessica Evans. I'm from the Goddard Office of Communications, and I am so honored to be our host for today's session. And I want to start off by saying thank you so much to Wade Sisler and Liz Gerald and Travis Woolrab for their work on the StoryLab series. And as always, thanks to all of you for continuing to turn up and to support our amazing storytellers. And it is my honor to introduce our guest. American conductor Emil de Cou has served as a musical advisor to NASA through 4 administrations since 2006, collaborating on projects that have celebrated landmark anniversaries of the agency, classic space-themed orchestral suites, and more. Today, he will share with us some of his experiences in creating these performances, as well as his encounters with NASA astronauts and other space legends. Emil is the musical director of the Pacific Northwest Ballet in Seattle. He was previously an associate conductor of the National Symphony Orchestra here in DC, and he was hired by renowned choreographer Mikhail Baryshnikov as the conductor of the American Ballet Theatre for 8 seasons. Performances with NASA have included The Planets, narrated by Star Trek actor Leonard Nimoy, a Voyager Golden Record Concert, an Apollo 50th Anniversary Celebration, and most recently a concert at the United Nations Climate Change Conference. He is the first musician to receive NASA's Exceptional Public Achievement Medal. Emil was born in Los Angeles and studied with Daniel Lewis at the University of Southern California, and he was chosen to study in Leonard Bernstein's masterclass at the Hollywood Bowl. Today, he makes his home in San Francisco and Seattle with his husband, conductor Leif Bjaaland. Emil, welcome to Goddard.
Thank you so much. Well, it's so great to be with you. Thank you for joining us this morning. And wow, I just love that picture of the NASA meatball behind the National Symphony Orchestra at the Kennedy Center. That has been there for, I don't know, at least 20 plus concerts, not just the evening concerts, but also educational concerts. And the orchestra is so devoted to what we do at the Kennedy Center, especially with education and especially with NASA. So it's great to be here and to talk about our collaborations over the years. Just as a little bit of a background, I actually came to music late. My first passions and loves were NASA in the 1960s and science fiction and fantasy. And they kind of merged together, especially during the 60s and the Apollo program. And I will never forget watching the moon landing as a little kid and then driving with my bicycle around Orange County, California, and looking at the sky, thinking that there are 2 people up there. It was the most amazing thing. I had kind of an epiphany in a way, because I was adrift like a lot of kids can be in their teenage years in high school, and I did love science and NASA and fantasy and science fiction, but I didn't know quite what to do as far as finding a career. And I remember going to my high school guidance counselor, and they have all these little pamphlets they used to have in the 70s of possible careers, and one was being an aerospace engineer, because a lot of my friends, parents, and fathers worked for Rockwell or McDonnell Douglas, and so I got a little booklet about being an aerospace engineer, which I thought was really cool. But then I started to get involved in music. I had a teacher, actually a history teacher, a single mother, and kind of looked after me in a very sweet way. And there was, back in the 70s, you know, they had re-releases of films. So Disney's Fantasia was only re-released like every 5 years, I think. And certainly there was no videotape back then. And she took me to a small theater in Garden Grove, California, to see Fantasia that was just re-released in a theater. And so I walked into this very small movie theater in Garden Grove and saw this movie I'd never seen before, or even heard of, or had heard any of the music before. So I'm watching this movie next to this teacher, who was just the kindest person you can imagine. And there's Leopold Stokowski, and he's conducting the Rite of Spring. He's conducting the Pastoral Symphony and the Nutcracker Suite and Night on Bald Mountain. And I just remember so clearly, she leans over to me because she knew I was a little bit adrift as a kid in school. And she just, there's Stokowski on the screen, and she says, "Why don't you do that?" And I'm looking at this great man, and it planted a seed in my head. And I thought, yes, that's what I want to do, which seems like the most absurd, ridiculous thing you could think of a little kid who barely learned how to read music in high school band, looking at the great Leopold Stokowski. And from that moment on, I dedicated myself to music. And my parents, who didn't come from an absolute background whatsoever, were incredibly encouraging. And there was this idea that you could do anything you want to do. And my mother, I mean, she'd never gone to a symphony concert before. And she says, well, if you just, if you want it badly enough, then give it a try. And so I think it's one of those things in life where if you don't know how difficult something is, you're not afraid of trying to do it. And had I known back then to be employed as a symphony conductor, I mean, there's maybe 2 in every major city at the most, or maybe 3 in New York City. I just thought that's what I want to do. And the great thing is I was able to combine my love of science fiction and NASA some years later with music. And so it kind of became part of a whole. But with the thing with music, and I think also why I conduct ballet a lot. I conduct movie concerts a lot and pops concerts. But I like the idea that music and symphony concerts can be more than just abstract music. That there's something, maybe because I'm from Los Angeles, but just the marriage of music and imagery, if it's film or if it's live, theater, dance, opera, made the most sense to me. And so some years later, my first job, I was hired in New York City by Mikhail Baryshnikov at American Ballet Theatre. And so it was just this interesting combination of being able to do, at least beginning to do, what I would like to do later in life. And every year we had our Met season. So we're at Lincoln Center for, I think, 6 weeks towards early spring. And then we would go on tour. And so one of our first tour cities was Washington, D.C., which I'd never been to before. So we'd be there for a week at the Kennedy Center. And I have the afternoons off or sometimes the whole day off. And so I'd always go to the Air and Space Museum, which is still my favorite museum in the district. And I came across the bookshop, and they had a copy of a book that's long out of print called Murmurs from Earth about the Voyager Golden Record. And so I thought, wow, I'd love to do a concert of the Voyager Golden Record. I remember it was kind of put together by, well, of course, Carl Sagan and Andrew, and also the conductor Murray Sidlin, who was the first associate conductor in the 1970s, the Exxon Arts Endowment conductor of the NSO. And so they worked together on this idea, and Murray wanted to do a concert tour with Carl Sagan just about the Golden Record. But that didn't happen because of his untimely early passing. So I thought it would be great to do a concert of the Golden Record, because I never heard anybody doing such a thing before. Because it's one of those things I find it's such a pure aspirational thing. This message in a bottle to whoever finds it. But I think actually it's mostly for us, not so much for aliens, of what's best and most treasured on Earth. And it is images, pictures of ordinary life, but most importantly, it's the music that we hold dear. If it's world music, if it's ethno music, if it's classical music, jazz, rock, this is us. And to try to encapsulate all of what we hold most dear on that primitive message in a bottle, I thought would be great to bring to concerts. So I was hired by the New World Symphony, which is in Miami Beach, founded by Michael Tilson Thomas. And they said, what would you like to do? I said, I'd like to do a Voyager Golden Record Concert. And so when I went to Air and Space again, I went to the gift shop. And this is, a while ago. I think it's in the early 90s or so. And so I got all these color slides, which they sold, and Murmurs from Earth, which comes with a CD of the sounds encoded on the record. And so you could put the slide. I think there's a program of that first concert with New World Symphony, and it works incredibly well because the music is very eclectic. And there was a later concert I did of the same idea, but just you have Stravinsky, you have Mozart, Magic Flute, Armstrong, Louis Armstrong, one of the greats. And this whole kind of hodgepodge of different types of music And at the time, I think we had the color slides just going randomly above the orchestra, and it worked incredibly well. And so some years later, I was guest conductor of the National Symphony Orchestra at Wolf Trap as a last-minute substitution for a film, actually. And I was working at the time at the San Francisco Ballet as acting music director. And in music, it's easy to get pigeonholed, and I found myself in some ways getting pigeonholed as only conducting ballet. And I thought, I love ballet music and I love theater, but I wanted to do more than just that. And so I quit my job in San Francisco, which was kind of a risky thing to do because it's very hard to get employed as a symphony conductor anywhere. But I just wanted to do more than just that. And the National Symphony Orchestra had an opening just as a assistant conductor, which isn't that big a deal next to what I had been doing. But I thought that I'll give it a shot and see what else might be out there. And so they said, "What would you like to do?" So I wanted to recreate this concert, but on a bigger scale, because I think the message of this idea of the Golden Record is just so powerful. And do we have the next? What is the next image we have? Is it? Yes. So some years later, when I met my friend Bert Ulrich, went to NASA headquarters, and I think this is at the archive downstairs, and they had a replica of the Golden Record. And by then, I still had not started to collaborate directly with NASA, so I kind of recreated the concert I did in Miami Beach at New World Symphony with slides, except for you have that gorgeous concert hall at the Kennedy Center. And so when people walked in, we had all the sounds of whale sounds and nature sounds, and this just going through the concert hall as people walked in, and messages, hello, and all the greetings from the United Nations. And above the orchestra, we had this giant screen where they would just run the images encoded on the disc, just randomly. And then we had the program, which was a bit bigger program that we did in Miami, more expansive. And I just noticed that the images, in some strange way, kind of took on their own weight or own importance just by the randomness and also with the music playing underneath. And it was quite lovely and very, very, very hopeful. And so after that, I've been conducting the Anti-Defamation League concerts with the National Symphony for the past, I think, 16 years. We do a yearly concert where we honor survivors or people who have triumphed over adversity and anti-Semitism and racism. And so we have different hosts every year. And one year we had Leonard Nimoy in 2004, I think, as our host for that concert. And after the concert, we went out to 600 Watergate restaurant with his wife, Susan, and just started talking, because I was absolutely in awe of this band from being a kid in the 60s watching the original series. And then there he is. And he's the nicest person you could ever hope to meet. Also love music very much. And so we're just talking about what we might be able to do in the future. And I remember Susan went to get something at the bar, and we're just talking, but maybe we could do this or do this. And I think I started to write something down on a piece of paper, and she comes back and berates the both of us, like, "Leonard, what are you doing? You're trying to, get more work here at the Kennedy Center?" And so it wasn't the Kennedy Center, but actually we had the idea to have the planets with Leonard Nimoy at Wolf Trap with images from NASA. And now this is done all the time. It's kind of an ordinary thing, and it irks me a little bit because we were the first orchestra to do such a thing. And so we had rewritten a script of, based on astrology and science fiction and Star Trek and science, of a narration for the planets, especially written for Leonard Nimoy. And so we had the scriptwriter for the Kennedy Center Honors come up with something. We rearranged the suite of the Gustav Holst and presented it at Wolf Trap in 2006. And that was my first year as NSO Wolf Trap Festival conductor. And I think it was my second concert there. And it sold out in, I think, a few days. It was incredible. And orchestras are used to audiences, certainly, and applause, certainly. But I'll never forget when Leonard Nimoy walked on stage, the audience erupted. It sounded like a football game. I thought the orchestra was going to run off stage because I'd never heard such an ovation. And I think we might have a picture of Leonard Nimoy narrating this at the next slide, possibly. Oh, there's Voyager, yes. We can skip ahead to that. The next one. And the first half was fantasy and science fiction music, including Star Trek and Star Wars and Outer Limits, and it was a good mix of things in the first half. And the first half ended with music from Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. And if you know this film, you'll know at the very end, Leonard Nimoy says the famous Space, the Final Frontier monologue that Shatner has said for the original series. And we had spoken on the phone, but he forgot that I asked him to do this. And so, of course, I know this like the back of my hand, and I don't think he probably has seen the Wrath of Khan since he made it. And so in Wolf Trap, there's a very large green room, and there are two dressing room doors. And so we shared this room, and I said, well, do you want to rehearse Wrath of Khan? Because at the end, right before the end credits, he says the famous monologue. And he goes, "What goes? I don't understand. What are you talking about?" I said, "Oh, you might have forgotten. I asked if you would say the monologue from off stage, so the audience wouldn't see him until he comes out to narrate the planets." And so we're at the piano with the lid down, and he goes, and he has a piece of paper. He goes, "How does it go again?" I thought, "Oh my God, I feel like I'm having an out of body experience." And so I'm just like, "Space, the Final Frontier." He's writing it down, and I just wish I had that piece of paper. I don't know where it went. And so we rehearse, and then I'm in the room getting dressed for the concert, and he's in his room behind the door, and I hear him practicing the lines, saying with different inflections, like space, space, the final frontier. I thought, wow, this is the coolest thing I've ever experienced. It was so great. But he was such an extraordinary person, and I wish that we could have recreated this concert, because it was amazing. The orchestra will never forget it, and I think the audience, it really stuck with them, because it was just, again, it was just so wonderfully unusual. And the next year, we had a program called Fantastic Planet, and that was the first real collaboration with NASA for the host of planets. I remember going to headquarters for the first time. And we had Bob Jacobs, we had Bert, I forget, some other people from NASA TV, Cedric Harris. And since an orchestra hadn't collaborated with NASA to that degree, they were kind of cautious, and also, needing to make sure it goes right. And so we had several meetings there, and I was just thrilled to be able to go to NASA headquarters. And the second concert, we decided to do kind of like a version of Fantasia, in a way, where it was mostly abstract images, but with a theme. So the first half of the concert was nature and Earth, violent Earth. I think do we have a slide for that? I don't think we do. But anyway, so we had like the Rite of Spring showing violent Earth. We had the Wild West with John Williams, the Cowboys, and second half starts with Earth from Space. Ralph Vaughan Williams, Serenade to Music, and then going to Very Distant Space. That was computer-generated images, and this is 2007. So it's not what you would do today, but it was still pretty darn good at the time. And my favorite part is we had music of Atmospheres by Ligeti, which is the end, if you remember the end of 2001 Space Odyssey, where the lights going crazy. That's that music. It sounds like electronic music, but it's all acoustic. So it's all this like very far imagined space. And then we start with the Berceuse finale from Stravinsky the Firebird. And then we slowly went from imagined distant space, flying as the music gets faster, flying through solar system, throwing around the planets, And then at the very end, you see Earth in the distance gets closer, and they were able to somehow fly from space through through the clouds, through the atmosphere, and landing at Wolf Trap. And that was the very end of the concert, and that was such a thrill. After that, we had, I think a couple of years later, it was the 50th anniversary of the founding of NASA, and this was at Udvar-Hazy Museum, and it was the first time we had the so-called Space Philharmonic, which I think Bert thought of the name, which still makes me laugh because it's kind of ridiculous sounding, but we had a good time. It's basically the National Symphony Orchestra, but hired under a different guise, so it was much less expensive. And so we had Frank Sinatra Jr., we had Quincy Jones, and sang Fly Me to the Moon. And Mike Griffin was administrator at the time. And we only played at the very end. I think John Glenn was there and Neil Armstrong. And then Mike Griffin, who's just wonderful, and Becky, who all helped plan a lot of these concerts as well. He gets his glasses and puts them on and gets out of his suit jacket this big piece of paper. I thought, ooh, this is going to go on for a bit. And so I think we went into like 3 segments of overtime before we started to play. And then we got Quincy Jones, who was such a great man, and Frank Sinatra Jr., who actually sounded remarkably like his father. And that was the first concert we did outside of the Kennedy Center or outside of Wolf Trap. And the next 2 years later, we had our biggest collaboration, which is it's called Salute to Apollo. It was the 2 days before the moon landing, is July 18th, 2009. It was the 40th anniversary. And we had Buzz Aldrin as narrator, Scott Altman. June Lockhart was there. We had Nichelle Nichols, who was Uhura on Star Trek on screen. She couldn't be there in person. The U.S. Army Chorus and Gene Kranz, who was at the very end, who conducted the encore. Do we have a picture of that? I'm not sure, Travis. I think we might. Anyway, yes, that was the beginning of the concert. And that was such a thrill because it was such an important occasion. And to have the NSO and to have all these stars there to celebrate this amazing moment. And I just remember backstage, June Lockhart, what a dear. She's so amazing. She just loves NASA so much and so dedicated. And so we're backstage, and for some reason I shared a dressing room with Buzz and June, which is kind of, I mean, we didn't change clothes, but still, it's kind of an unusual thing to share such a room. And there's June Lockhart in the hallway, and sitting in a wheelchair. She didn't need one; she just had a random wheelchair as a seat. And I said, "What are you doing?" And she goes, "Well, didn't you see that the dressing room was like all disheveled with all these people in there?" And there was Nichelle, who didn't sing, but she was being interviewed in June, and it was just really great. We had a fun thing. So a couple of years later, we had a program called Human Spaceflight at Kennedy Center, the Kennedy Legacy, which is the 50th anniversary of his famous speech of "Send a Man to the Moon" before this decade is out. Charlie Bolden was the presenter. We had the Kennedy family was involved in the program, and Herbie Hancock is pianist. And I think we had a lot of young kids there as well, and kind of a mix of some of the things we've done in the past, but also some new things. And Nichelle did sing in that concert. That's right. She was a Duke Ellington band singer actually when she started out, and remember she had to be quite nervous to sing. The thing with Gene Roddenberry, because she is very close to Gene Roddenberry, is that Alexander Courage wrote the theme to Star Trek, the famous iconic theme, and Roddenberry wrote words to go with it, which was only used once in one episode of Star Trek. And so she sang those words, which are a little clumsy, but she was, I think, had good memories of being dear friends with him. So she sang that on that program, which was fun. I started working here in 2010 in Seattle as music director of the Pacific Northwest Ballet. And we had, I think the year after I started here, it was the 50th anniversary of the Seattle World's Fair, which is a science and industry World's Fair. And there's a huge NASA pavilion near the Space Needle, which was built for the World's Fair, and it was one of the most popular exhibits of that fair. The Science Center is still there. We had Katie Coleman, astronaut, and Babak Firdausi, who works at JPL, who has worked on the Curiosity project, and actually is from Washington and went to University of Washington. And we had a Curiosity animated video of what it would look like when it landed. So that was part of the show as well. And there's Michelle, who sang the theme to Star Trek. And some years later, we had a showing of 2001: A Space Odyssey at Wolf Trap. And I think Buzz was going to the Cape to do a talk or something. It was a couple days after this concert, but he was there, and we did a talk with Charlie Bolden, Arvind Manchoa, who's the director of Wolf Trap, and I at the Barnes. And so we just spoke about the film, we spoke about NASA, and I remember Buzz was very fervent about not going back to the moon and going to Mars. And he kept saying, "Get your ass to Mars," to this group, which just loved it. And going off message and talking about the Chinese space program, and there's Charlie trying to get him back on message so it doesn't wind up causing an international scandal. And it was fun. But Buzz Aldrin is an amazing force of nature, as you know. And so it was getting late, and he wasn't going to stay to see the film because it's a very long film, and he had to get up early the next morning. But I remember just saying, he says, "I want to see the monkeys." I thought, the monkeys? Oh, at the beginning of the film. So we put a chair next to the chorus, because the chorus in the soundtrack. So we had a huge symphony chorus, organ, brass. The orchestra is gigantic for that movie. And somebody has put a random chair next to the organ, next to the chorus. And so I'm conducting the beginning, the 2001 fanfare, the famous one, and I look, and there's Buzz Aldrin sitting in the very corner behind a bunch of brass players watching the screen in reverse, because you can see it from the other side as well. And I thought, that's kind of an out-of-body experience. But it was fun. And so we had the next program is June 1 and 2, 2018. It's called Space: The Next Frontiers. It's 60th anniversary of the founding of NASA. And there's my dear friend Bert. And it's interesting how these programs get planned, because you don't want them to be just kind of like background music and images. You want the music to inform what you're seeing and the other way around. And so it's very hard to really decide what exactly you're going to play and why, because there has to be a reason. You can't just do, Star Wars over and over again. So actually we planned that concert at Mel's Diner on Sunset Boulevard in Hollywood, because I think we were there for the technical Emmys. I think NASA had been given a delayed Emmy for putting the camera on the outside of the lunar module. So we were there for that. And for that concert, we had Michael Giacchino, the film composer, write a special piece just for this concert called Voyage. And John Cho was the actor who played Sulu in the rebooted Star Trek. And so he wrote a poem about his voyage, his family coming from China to the United States. And Michael wrote this very, very beautiful piece that was the first of 2 commissions he wrote for NASA. And that's me dressed in, I don't know what, a space jumpsuit. It looks kind of ridiculous with dry ice all over the stage. Production values got a lot better over the years. And yes, I did take that off after I conducted that opening piece, mostly because it's quite hot. We had Apollo 11 50th anniversary in 2019, and that is still our biggest collaboration to date. There was if you remember, this huge exhibit on the National Mall, the Washington Monument was lit up with imagery of the original Apollo 11 launch. We had Michael Giacchino wrote his second piece, which is called Advent. And we had actually the concert at an unusual time. It was much later than you normally have a symphony concert, because it was done without intermission, so it was about an hour and a half of music. And Michael's piece was supposed to line up with the exact time that Neil Armstrong stepped on the lunar surface. And so that was the middle of the piece of music. And it actually timed out, I think, pretty close. And Michael had written this piece, which is a very, very beautiful. You can hear Advent, and you can hear Voyage on YouTube if you want to give a listen sometime. They're both beautiful pieces. And for the second piece he wrote, we had to, it drove the people in the Kennedy Center a little nuts, because you're not supposed to have people standing in the aisles. There's all these rules and fire rules and this and that. And so he had put, I think, 20 Tibetan prayer bowls in the key of C. And these are very beautiful, huge ceramic bowls, different sizes, that you have like a bass drum or timpani mallet with a soft, spongy tip. And you kind of rub it, and it makes this very ethereal sound. And so the moment that Armstrong steps on the moon, narrated by Walter Cronkite on the screen, is exactly when this thing happened. And then suddenly you hear this wordless soprano singing is so exquisite. It's just hit the exact right moment of this great moment in history, and this great moment of, I don't know, almost like a spiritual moment with such a thing comes together. We had Nick Sagan, who's Carl Sagan's son, and we had a segment of Golden Record again, and played the Pale Blue Dot from Cosmos, which is terrific. What you're seeing now is the most recent concert we've done that was put together, well, with me and Bob Jacobs and Bert Ulrich and Wade Sisler. This is a climate change COP26 conference. It was the first concert in the Royal Scottish Concert Hall since the pandemic. It's the Conservatory Orchestra. And so we had, over the course of the concert, over 100 musicians on stage playing music from the Baroque up until rock and roll. So there was a harpsichord, there was an organ, there was a rock organ, and everything in between. And I remember calling, I was with Bert, and we called Wade and just said, what would you like to do? And he had the idea of having, as part of this conference, which informs our awareness of climate change, the Vivaldi Four Seasons, which we did over, I think, this with excerpts for about 10 minutes. And he came up with this such beautiful imagery. And the pairing of the music, again, it just informed one another in a very beautiful way. We had a greeting from the International Space Station, and there's that. And we had these very, very young musicians who were just so thrilled to play. They'd not played together for 2 years. And so if you're 16, 17, that's a sizable time of your life as a musician. And just to be able to come together and play all this great music, and it was a sensational concert. It really was in every possible way. And it was the only concert during that conference. And a lot of what we do, which is not really seen, is education towards kids. So all the concerts I've mentioned, all the concerts I've done together with NASA, over I think 20 at least, all of those concerts were reused in part for education concerts at the Kennedy Center, and this is in Anacostia, actually, at the Arc. And so in some ways, these concerts have been more promoted towards education than towards evening performances. And I go back to where I started as a kid in Orange County, and you just never know. And that's the thing I love, I think, most about NASA, is I remember writing as a kid. I would write to NASA headquarters when I was probably 10 years old or so, just asking for a picture or something. And, many weeks later, you get this huge envelope in the mail with pictures of the moon, lunar module, astronauts, which I plastered all over my bedroom wall. And you just never know what spark you might put in some young person or older person's imagination that will then develop into something that you have no idea where it will go. And when I first started working with NASA, I sensed the same intent and the same sort of pure love for sharing this passion, which is still part of the culture, I think always has been, with NASA. And so I remember that when we're doing these young people's concerts, that you just never know what you might do. It might be entertainment, it might be life-changing, or anything in between. And there's my friend Alex Reddick, who is musicologist at Harvard, and also has written the most recent book about the Golden Record called Aliens Listening, Voyager's Golden Record and the Music of Earth. And it's published by Zone Books, and it's a real wonderful find. It has a good sort of sense of humor of what might happen if somebody or something finds our golden record and they're able to decode how to play an LP with a stylus, which most teenagers wouldn't be able to figure out, but maybe the aliens can. And that was part of the filming that they did for WETA, a short documentary that was actually nominated for a local Emmy Award, which was fun. And it's a very, well, it was, I think, it was 8 days before the landing of Curiosity. And so we had the planets in the second half of the program at Wolf Trap in summer. I think it was in August. And Charlie Bolden introduced the opening piece we had, which was a music by Georges Bizet, and it was accompanying computer-generated images of what it would look like when Curiosity lands, with the sky crane and all this fantastic stuff happening. And I remember seeing that, and I thought, my God, that's the most ridiculous thing. It's not going to land at all. It looks so implausible. Anyway, so we played that, and Charlie came out, and I did not expect that I was presented with the NASA Exceptional Public Achievement Medal at the concert. And having studied in Europe, in Vienna, and graduate school at USC, but I didn't finish a degree. Because I was so impatient with wanting to get on with having a career in music that I went to Europe when I was 19, and so I didn't finish my undergraduate degree. I went to USC graduate school but couldn't get the degree. And so for me, this is one of my most treasured possessions. It's my medal and plaque from Charlie Bolden. And it's something that has stayed with me so much. And it's one of those strange things in life that, starting out as a little geeky, nerdy kid in Orange County, loving science and not knowing what to do, and then music, and then many, many years later, being an older, geeky kid who still loves science and music, to have the administrator of NASA do something like that was absolutely extraordinary. And just reminds me of the importance that the duty we all have, especially with kids, to give as much as you can, because you never know where life will go. So thank you so much for your time and for being here this morning. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Emil. That was amazing. And I actually didn't realize that you had conducted the Apollo 50th concert at the Kennedy Center. I know a lot of us from Goddard did go into DC to attend that concert and heard the Michael Giacchino pieces and such, and it was absolutely amazing. So I would have mentioned that at the beginning if I had realized.
Oh no, that's.
We have some questions, some amazing questions from the audience, and I'm sorry, didn't mean to cut you off. I think there's just a slight delay. First question from Jake Richmond says, Emil, since the phenomenon of pandemic isolation, it seems the uniqueness of live entertainment is becoming more and more valuable. Have you envisioned any new collaborations, methods, etc., that could capitalize on the new demand for innovative performance and perhaps bring in more uninitiated, younger, non-traditional, i.e. bigger audiences?
Yeah, that's an excellent idea, an excellent question. And in many ways, the pandemic has changed how people think, at least in the classical music world, how you reach an audience. And I think pop music is much, much better at this. Classical music changes very slowly. In many ways, if you go to a Philadelphia Orchestra concert or New York Philharmonic or San Francisco, a lot of the way people used to present concerts is pretty much the way they presented them in the 1950s. And with the pandemic and being closed off to performing in front of live audiences, a lot of things were online. Everything is streamed, otherwise you're invisible or people don't hear you at all. And so that has stuck with classical music now that we're coming back to live performances, of different ways of reaching people and realizing if you're not streaming concerts, if you're not making them accessible, then you're reaching a very small audience. And the thing with these concerts, especially in the summer concerts and the concerts I've done with NASA, is people go to Apollo 50th concert or NASA's 60th or Planets at Wolf Trap, and they're not realizing they're hearing a symphony orchestra concert. They're going to an event. And coming from a background where my family did not go to classical concerts or orchestra concerts at all, the hardest thing is getting people to go for the first time. And so when you have, say, if you do ballet, which I do a lot, if you do Prokofiev Cinderella, which was written during the Second World War, and actually is a very, in many ways, a very dark score, I'll walk to the Opera House here in Seattle, and there'll be hundreds of kids, little kids, dressed like in Disney costumes. And I thought, wow, well, they're going to see the story of Cinderella as a ballet, but they're going to hear 3 hours of really great Prokofiev. And if you just had a concert of Prokofiev Cinderella, you'd have not a lot of kids dressed in costume. You'd have just not a lot of people, actually. So the hard thing is just to break the mold, is just to get people to think in a different way, in a new way. And also to keep the substance of what we do, because that's very important. But yes, it has really changed, and now you'll see, you know, even though we're back doing live concerts again, almost everything is streamed at the same time. And I noticed too, coming back, like the concert in Glasgow that we did, it sold out in a second, and people were so hungry to just be together, to be, you know, in a theater, to watch, you know, a play, or to hear music, or to see a movie. It's just we're hardwired as beings on Earth to be social animals and to be part of something that is spiritually uplifting.
Absolutely. I love that answer. Our next is not actually a question, but rather a comment from Al Feinberg, who says, Emil, great memories of working with you at NASA TV.
Al, thank you so much. I remember one of the first times I went to NASA headquarters it was mostly NASA TV at the time, and some images from Goddard, but they were so eager to do something collaborative with an orchestra because they hadn't done that before. And I think a lot of what NASA TV was doing at the time were corporate presentations or you know, something more wonky. But I sent them the planets to send a recording. I think it was probably Eugene Ormandy in the Philadelphia Orchestra, as just placeholders, and just have them create images. And it was stunning what they came. I mean, such amazing talent. I mean, not just talent for videos, just artistic talent to do this wedding of music and imagery in a very profound way. And like Wade did with the Vivaldi Four Seasons. So it was until then an untapped resource, and wow, what they did was extraordinary.
Our next question is from David, which says, many astronauts and space tourists say they draw their own inspirations after actually being in space. Now that space is more accessible, relatively speaking, do you have any aspirations to go to space as a tourist and perhaps draw musical inspiration from the journey?
That is fantastic. You know, I would love to, but I'm terribly afraid of heights. I think I'm the only person in Seattle who's never been to the top of the Space Needle. So I like the idea in principle. But you know, also I remember I met Alan Bean. I think at the Apollo 40th concert. And the astronauts I've met, and especially the few Apollo astronauts I've met, they have tried to express what it's like to go into space. I remember Alan Bean was an artist, and there was an exhibit at Air and Space of just his art, and he would use, I think he used part of his spacesuit, and there's some lunar dust or something that he put on these paintings, which were quite beautiful. And I thought, wow, you know, it's just. It is impossible. I'm sure they're probably sick of asking or answering the question, what was it like to stand on the surface of the moon? Because it can't be explained. And I just love, you know, how Buzz wrote his book but they've all tried to express it in different ways because it's something you can't explain, which is lovely. It's part of the great mystery.
It is. It absolutely is, and such an inspiration to all of us, who continue to be on the ground. Next question is from Kay Northen and says, Emil, who is your favorite composer and why is it or is it not Puccini?
It's funny because as you get older, you can hear the same music, but you hear it differently. And when I was very young, I loved Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique and Tchaikovsky because it's these like emotionally hysterical most of the time. I still love Tchaikovsky very much, but as I get older, I think you appreciate things in a slower way. And actually, currently, I love Schubert, and Schubert is played less and less and less. When I was young, the Unfinished Symphony, the Great C Major Symphony, art songs, piano sonatas were played all the time. Rosamunde. And now you may see a Schubert symphony program once a year, if that. But I still love Tchaikovsky. It just is so honest. And I think why his music is so great is because he was kind of childlike in a way. Say if you look at this ballet Swan Lake, which we performed last month, he wrote that initially, the beginning, the famous B minor Swan Lake theme, for his nieces and nephews, and they made a little ballet in his sister's living room with him playing the piano, called The Lake of the Swans. And then 7 years later, he wrote the music for Swan Lake. But it's like Nutcracker, which is his last great ballet, is incredibly childlike, and just it speaks. It kind of passes the brain and goes right to your heart. But there's such an honesty about his music that I always still love so much. And also, with the pandemic, and we had 11 performances of Swan Lake at the Opera House here, and just all this repressed anxiety of the past, 2+ years, and the orchestra's playing at the end of Swan Lake, which ends in B major after you hear the famous B minor theme over and over and over again, and you finally get this B major ending, this cathartic ending, and the orchestra was like practically in tears at the end because it's been such a terrible and difficult time, let alone with what's happening in Ukraine, which also is unspeakable.
Yep. That's on that note, going into another question about inspiration. This is also from David. NASA plans to go back to the moon and eventually to Mars via the Artemis program. Part of it involves getting the public behind the program with communications and promotional efforts. If you could develop a soundtrack that would get the public behind Artemis, what would such a soundtrack sound like?
Oh my. Oh. Well, I think I'd commission new work from John Williams and Michael Giacchino.
Oh, yes.
That would be splendid. That'd be splendid. It's funny because nobody mentioned, I think in the 1960s, and very few people at least, because the Apollo program was incredibly expensive. But it was just the inspiration of someone like John Kennedy, who started the whole thing, supported through Johnson and Nixon, leadership. And with that, you always had the arts. And I remember meeting James Dean, who was the first art, I think it was called art curator at NASA. And when it was founded by President Eisenhower, there was always an artistic component. And Bert Ulrich now has that position. And so the arts and science were always married. And I remember actually with Leonard Nimoy was saying that everything that NASA does, everything that we have in science and technology today was imagined as fantasy or as a story or as a novel hundreds of years or even more oftentimes before it actually became reality. And so that's why I think it's important to always have that imagination, that artistic component to get people excited about something that hasn't yet happened. And I think that in music, Michael Giacchino is one of the most amazing composers I've met. And again, I think a lot of that is he's kind of a big kid himself, and so I think that's one of the first things you lose. You know, when you get beat up by life, that we all do, is to lose that childlike spark, and that's what makes everything come alive. And even as an orchestra conductor, I've conducted so many great orchestras, but what they want is that inspiration, that guidance that comes from that source of being a wide-eyed little kid.
I love that. I love that. And we have one more question from David, which is similar to Kay Northen's question, which is, who are your favorite pop artists or contemporary musicians?
Wow, that's kind of tricky. Pop artists. You know, I don't really listen to a lot of current popular music. I hate to say, I sound kind of like a fuddy-duddy, but I do listen to a lot of jazz. And if you want to hear something extraordinary, listen to Oscar Peterson. And my father's from New Orleans, and my mom's from Hawaii. So I grew up in a house with all sorts of strange music, Hawaiian music. Don Ho and Art Tatum all lived in our house. But I find a lot of inspiration with jazz musicians, especially Oscar Peterson. So I think he was such a brilliant genius. I love, well, pop performers. I love Bert Bacharach, who's still with us. I think he's 92. He's writing his next musical coming up after he wrote Promises, Promises at 92 with a new idea for a whole show. And he's kind of like our American Schubert. I love Bert Bacharach.
I never would have thought of that. I love Bert Bacharach as our American Schubert. I'm going to hang on to that one. We have, let's see, we have a couple more questions. We are running short on time. We have 8 minutes left, but I think we have time to get through these. Question from Emily J. For those of us working technical things in our jobs, how would you suggest infusing music or other creative aspects into our work? What would you say is the value of integrating the arts into STEM?
Well, I think they're essential. I think you can't, if you go to the Jefferson Building of Library of Congress, and there's a great rotunda, and this is aspirational from the Enlightenment, which is the founding of our country. And you look at the dome above, and you look at all the disciplines, and they're all equal. It was literature, poetry, history, music, art. And they all inform one another. You can't just have, I remember when I was studying music in school, and I was very focused in music. And I remember one of my other teachers from one of the other disciplines called it, you have to focus on your serious subjects, not your fun subjects. I thought, well, music is like a fun subject because it's beautiful or it's artful, but it is fun, but every subject should be fun. And you can't just focus on math, science, literature without everything else involved, because that's the catalyst that makes everything else happen. And that's why the Enlightenment is such a fascinating, contradictory, unusual time. But it was like the Big Bang for mankind, and certainly for this country. But you look at the Jeffersonian ideal, and he was a musician. He was one of the greatest men of his era. But he enjoyed all these things, and they were all equally important. And if you just focus on one or the other, you're missing out on the whole idea.
Wonderful. And we have 5 minutes left. So I'll keep on going, and we'll go until we have no more time. Kay Northen chimes in again and says, sadly, we lost Ennio Morricone in 2020. His profound work felt as visceral as personal experience. What would you say about his work? Do you have any personal experience with it?
With Morricone, no. I've conducted some of his scores, but not anything more personal than that, but is a great composer. And also James Horner, who we lost some years ago, who wrote, he wrote Star Trek II and many other things, Titanic, of course. But listen to, you can go online. The last thing he wrote was a concert piece for four horns and orchestra recorded by the London Symphony. And it's absolutely fantastic. And there are very few composers, film composers, who can also write very effective concert music. John Williams is one of them, Michael Giacchino, of course, and James Horner. So if you get a chance, give a listen, or just listen to the end credits of Star Trek II. It's one of the most thrilling things.
I completely agree. And our last question is from Kay Yang, and she says, Emil, thank you so much for, I apologize, says, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation and for all of your outstanding work making both classical music and NASA accessible to all audiences. My question is, what advice would you have for young children who are interested in classical music? And from your experience working with young musicians, are there good methods you've seen for children to find an instrument they're interested in playing and sticking with it?
Oh, that's a good question. It's very funny because it's a very personal thing to play an instrument, and just it has to fit with your personality. Not in a big way, but it's almost from when you're born. You're predisposed to being a certain person, a certain way. You have siblings who are very different from you, possibly, but you have to try an instrument until you find the one that sticks. And there are cliches in music that are rendered true. Brass players can be kind of like the bros, the jocks, boys and girls of the orchestra. Oboists can be kind of a little bit tightly wound. Flutists are kind of the princess of the orchestra. But it's just, you just have to kind of find according to what works for you. And, those are broad strokes, but there are lots of different personality types behind the instrument, and you're drawn to it for a certain reason. So just try as many instruments as you can, and you will find one that fits eventually. Absolutely. It could be something you wouldn't expect, but just be open to it and explore. It's a great adventure.
Wonderful. Wonderful. And that's our last question. So we're going to wrap up here. Emil, it's been such a pleasure having you here today and hearing your wonderful stories, not just working with NASA folks, but just, across the board, some of your experiences with music. I know we at NASA are honored to have helped inspire some of your work, and thank you also in return for inspiring us as well. And thank you for spending some time with us and answering our questions today.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure.
And thank you to all of you in the audience, as always, for attending today and helping us make Emil feel welcome. Before we wrap up, I want to make a plug for one of our Story Labs coming up later this fall. Please mark your calendars for Tuesday, September 20th. We will have the privilege of hearing Dr. Temple Grandin. She is a professor of animal science at Colorado State University, as well as being a world-renowned speaker on autism and animal behavior. Not together. Those are her two subjects of expertise. So we are very excited to have her coming to join us for her presentation titled Different Kinds of Minds. So please put Tuesday, September 20th on your calendars. And as always, stay tuned for additional Story Lab sessions in the meantime. Emil, thank you so much again for coming to NASA. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. Take care.